Hello, dear listener. A very brief trigger warning that we will briefly be discussing thoughts of serious self-harm during this episode. We touch on it quite quickly and pretty indirectly, but nevertheless, we wanted to provide that trigger warning before we started the episode.
Hello, and welcome back to the Delve podcast for another mini episode. I'm Allie. I'm a staff therapist here at Delve Psychotherapy of Chicago.
And I'm Adam. I'm the executive and clinical director at Delve Psychotherapy of Chicago.
Help us spread the word with our podcast. We're not looking for fame. We don't plan to run ads. We're really just trying to add value and be helpful to as many people as possible. So please share this podcast with others. We ask that you send to at least one other person that you think would find value. It'd be really helpful. Here at Delve Psych, we offer individual, couples, group, and family therapy. If you're interested in a free consultation call, head on over to delvepsych.com. That's DELVEPSYCH.com. And we also have a Substack where we write amazing blog posts over there with great topics, just like the ones we talk about here on the podcast. So head on over to delvepsych.substack.com.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And lovely to see you again, Allie, for another mini episode.
Yay. Lovely to see you too, Adam. I'm really interested in today's topic. How do we know if psychotherapy is working?
Yeah, so this might end up getting a little more technical than typical. I actually asked Allie permission to get a little sciencey on this one, and she told me it was okay. So my apologies to the listener if it's maybe not the kind of. We just had an episode on heart, and now I'm going all the way into like stats and research and science.
It's all good. We love science. Ooh, science.
So I should say my journey here has been one of I came from much more of the kind of stodgy scientific empirical approach. I love statistics. I love research methods. I've taught those classes. I TA'd some of those I TA'd multivariate statistics in my master's program. I've taught myself some basic Bayesian analyses, and like I love this stuff. So when I'm critical of it, I want to try to legitimize myself a little bit on the side of like I'm critical of these approaches not because I don't understand them. I think I understand them at a pretty high level. I just don't know that they're really the right ways to go about what we're trying to do as an institution, which was a really hard pill for me to swallow earlier in my career. Because I built a lot of my identity and a lot of my belief around stats and research methods specifically. And people who knew me in my master's program or early in my PhD program knew this about me, and would be quite surprised to hear about the change in tone over time. I just don't think it's working. At the end of the day, I don't think that this approach to understanding humans is really working.
I love the setup for this episode. It makes sense to me that you came from more of that sort of background. But knowing you now, I've only known you for like a little over a year and a half, maybe. Yes, I know how much your belief system is different on like the ways that we like, I don't know, evaluate growth in therapy and whether it's working, quote unquote. But I think, where do you want to start with this topic?
Well, in the last episode, you had started to talk a little bit about this idea of like, how do we know that psychotherapy is actually working? And in that episode, you also kind of hearkened to the difference between the hard sciences and the soft sciences. And I think that's a really good place to start, because one of the things that we need to kind of hone in on is the fact that in the more physical sciences, you have a truer way to most of the time measure something actually real. They would call it ontologically real, or a real ontology would be maybe be a more specific way to say that. than we do. We end up measuring constructs. So let's take a construct would be kind of like a general concept that we try to what's called operationalize into something that we could measure. So when you think about some of the things that we try to measure in psychotherapy, take a concept like happiness. Well, what is happiness? There's no probe that I can plug into anyone's human brain anywhere to suggest that I know how much happiness they have. I could take a blood sample and get a measure of hemoglobin or something of that nature. And I know exactly, at least I've got a specific measurement of something physical that's actually the thing that I'm trying to measure, actually real in the real world, in that kind of vial of hemoglobin. Now you can have sampling issues, right? Like maybe I got a sample that just had less of it in there than the general population, if you will, as the statistical term might have in it. But at base level, I'm actually measuring a real thing. And psychology can almost never do that.
Right. Because we're talking about like emotions and like how do you grasp on to an emotion and measure it?
Yes. Freedom, right? Like, how do you measure that? Depression, how do you measure that? So
We try to.
yes, and how do we go about doing that, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things I have this old YouTube channel. I haven't mentioned it. You might not even know that it exists. I don't know if I've talked to you about this before, but I made, I think, something like 46 stats and research videos under the title of The Sprightly Pedagogue. And they're still up, and some of them do quite well. But I got to an episode on reliability and validity, and I was going to start a whole series on reliability and validity. And I was on a really consistent publishing schedule. I was publishing constantly, and I got those 46 videos out quick, and I was learning a lot and getting a lot better. And then I got to this episode and I got stuck. And I kept thinking like, oh, I'm going to just kind of polish this little bit of research and then I'll be there. And what I didn't realize is that that was going to actually kick off some of my existential dread about the field. And really digging into what are these sources of validity in the way that we measure things really gave me a lot of pause. I want to hone in on two specific ones. So I've already been talking a little bit about this idea of, can we measure something real? This gets at an idea called criterion-related validity. And in the statistical sense, a criterion is one of those true things that is really real as an actual outcome. Take a concept like depression. The way that we talk about depression is if you have depression, that's bad. And if you don't have depression, then that's good. But if you think about it, depression by itself isn't actually an outcome problem. You could be depressed and still be functioning. Definitionally, that gets a little bit complicated. You could be depressed and that could be reasonable, especially if it's in response to grief or something of that nature, or maybe a midlife crisis or something like that. So at the end of the day, depression doesn't actually end up kind of working as an outcome, as a final outcome by itself, because hypothetically you could be fine while being depressed. So then what is the outcome? How do we, like, let's actually tackle that question for a second. So if it's not depression, is it functioning at work? What actually is it?
Right. My mind was going to, then it's the behaviors that sometimes accompany feelings of depression.
Such as,
not going to work, not being quote unquote productive, maybe like.
Which ends up, those two things end up being value judgments, right? So we've decided that work is good. Therefore, we must go to work, and it is a problem if we aren't. That's just Western thinking. And that's just a value judgment placed on this particular activity. That's not science, in my opinion. That's us kind of moralizing onto science.
True. I guess then there's also things like not taking care of ourselves, like not bathing, not brushing our teeth, not like, I don't know, doing that like standard upkeep sort of things.
So even those end up being secondary to other problems. So what are those other problems?
Secondary to other problems.
Well, think about it. Like if I don't take a bath today, does anything happen?
No, it's only, I guess, if you go out in the world and socialize, people would be like, but I don't know that if someone's like really depressed and maybe they're not going out and socializing either.
And let's
But
say they do try to go out and socialize and they get some negative feedback. Are we then saying that you must have positive feedback in social settings in order to be psychologically healthy? Again, we're back to a values judgment.
right, about how like people should be going about the world.
There you go. So psychology has this constant problem of like, as you try to define it and whatever the problem is, you often run into value judgments about how people should be living their lives. Now, I do think at some point there are health effects. So now we're sort of getting somewhere with respect to like, well, at a certain point, psychological functioning seems to have an impact on physical functioning. But even there, we've got something of an issue where a lot of the things that we might measure end up being secondary to a thing that we actually care about. And the link between one and the other can be really difficult to establish. So, I don't shower for a couple of days. What is the actual likelihood of some physical health problem as a result of that? And what is that problem?
I don't know. You would just be smelly. I don't know if there would be like an actual like.
Yeah. And is smelling actually a problem? Like again, we that's a values judgment we put on to the way that people should be living, not a thing that is just true inherently about the world. So that's one piece. I think at a certain point, maybe infection risk could increase.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So here we run into another problem. When is the last time that you read any psychological article that directly tied psychotherapy usage to infection risk?
I don't think I've ever
Yeah,
read
why
that article.
would you? Nobody would try to draw that link, right? So we end up
Yeah.
measuring these secondary things that we say are indicative of what might truly represent a real criterion, a real outcome.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't usually make that link very directly. And we aren't finding people that are going about like, does psychotherapy improve your dental hygiene? That study might exist. But does psychotherapy in a general sense end up predicting periodontal disease? That study might exist. But these are, again, like fringe cases kind of with people who've got specialties in these areas. We're not treating them as like, if the point of psychotherapy is health of some kind, we need a way of measuring what health actually really kind of represents. And then we ought to be tying those directly together. But we end up playing around with these intermediaries instead in these non-specific, disconnected ways, and talking about them as if they're real outcomes.
Absolutely. So I guess how should we be measuring this thing?
I don't know if I have an answer, honestly. And let me outline even more of the problem, if I may.
Yeah, please.
So that's just the problem of criteria and related validity. What are our actual outcomes? One that I think we can agree on is like dying by suicide. So that is a thing that we do measure. But when you look at the psychological science on predicting or reducing suicidal risk, I don't think that psychotherapy's done a terribly good job at that. A lot of the people who end up dying by suicide don't actually engage in psychological services at any point. And if you look at the rise in utilization of psychotherapy services against you transpose that against the rates of suicide in the United States, for instance, As we get more therapists and more access to therapy, the rates of suicide are not dropping. And so there's sort of some damning questions for us on that front. What are our actual outcomes? What are we trying to say this is all for? What are we trying to accomplish? And do we have any evidence to suggest that it's actually working?
Right, because otherwise, why would people engage if it's not working?
Right.
Um,
I promise I won't end this on a dour note.
yeah. It's interesting because even like the last question on our intake form is like, how will you be able to tell if therapy is working for you?
And now you might know where that question came from because I wrote that form.
And it's hard because I think a lot of the times clients answer that question with, I'll feel better.
And we have issues with that.
Yeah. And again, how do we measure that? I don't.
Yeah, exactly. Because someday I may feel better and then another day I may not feel better. That's not necessarily indicative of whether I am mentally healthy or not.
Mhm.
I will say that every year with the training program, I try to iterate on some of the core ideas of the practice and try to get the students to really help me think about it. So I will say, right before I went on vacation, I gave the students this year a framing of what I think psychological health might be. I gave them a phrase that I think psychological health may be. And I'm sorry to tease this, but not give it to you, because I asked them to take a couple of weeks and to just let it mess with them. Let them think about it and see if they want to change any of the words there. And I will be meeting with them immediately after this. And that's the first thing I'm going to ask them is, okay, what do we think? Is this a good definition for what mental health is? So perhaps after we've had some time to play with that a little bit more, you and I can come back to another episode and explore. But I do think that that's one of the active problems that psychology needs to be thinking about again, is what are we doing? What are we trying to do? What are we trying to accomplish? What is mental health at a basic level?
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah.
Also, I want the listener to imagine for a second that we were at the very beginning of psychology, all of psychology. This is the, late 19th century, and you're beginning to try to build some definitions of some basic phenomena in psychology. How would you go about doing it? What would you even do? Where would you even start? Nobody's
Yeah.
uttered the word depression before. Nobody's talking about anxiety. If they are, it's kind of in a general layperson English language sense. Where would you even begin?
I don't know. Observation. um, I don't know. I think um that's why maybe some of the more like behavioral approaches are like sort of like more of the like the earlier on approaches because it's something that you can actually like grasp onto and try to.
Behaviorism actually came a good bit later. The idea that observation comes to mind is an empirical. It's evidence of empiricism that we use our senses as a means of evaluating what is happening in the real world. That's part of the kind of empirical approach.
Uh-huh.
So we're taught that. So they didn't have access. Well, I mean, they did to some degree because the scientific method existed. But if I recall my history correctly, Wilhelm Wundt, his whole idea was to try to achieve understanding through introspection alone. And he eventually kind of lost that battle as people were calling that, subjective and soft, essentially. Lost out to materialism and observation and empiricism.
Yeah.
There was a lot of focus on reaction time early in psychological science. If I'm slower at doing whatever task you gave me, that must mean that I'm using more mental resources to be able to do it. There's some truth to that on some level. But you're probably just measuring certain kinds of neural activity, especially mediated by like the working memory areas of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, etc. So it's like, if you're starting off, you sort of have a vast number of options available to you for what direction to go. But there's not a lot of these kind of institutions locked in at this point to kind of ground you in anything. That's one thing. Two thing is, the other kind of validity that I think anytime we try to legitimize ourselves as a science, I think we need to remember the fact that content validity is one of the core ideas that you need for any construct that you're discussing. And how do we achieve it? We basically just ask experts, do you think that these ideas represent the construct? So that's just opinion.
Right.
And so if I were to say I've got a brand new measure for depression, the way that I would try to go about establishing that measure, I would need to establish construct validity, content validity, criterion related validity, and then there's some questions related to face validity. Construct validity would be, does it correlate with things that measure depression already in expert opinion? So does it correlate with existing measures of depression? It should. If I'm saying I'm measuring depression and that thing measures depression, it should measure the same thing. So we should be close statistically. It should not measure other things. So if I compare it to a test of anxiety, it shouldn't correlate as much with anxiety. It should correlate with the measure of depression. It shouldn't correlate with the measure of anxiety. So that's convergent versus discriminant validity. Then with respect to criterion related validity, it should be predictive of some criterion, but as we already discussed, the hell is that? I don't know what that is. And then with respect to content validity, let's say if it's a survey, do the items on here seem to represent the construct that I'm trying to measure? You're going to go to expert opinion on that. And the only way that you end up establishing, yes, this is a measure of depression with respect to content validity, is through subjective, expert, air quotes, expert opinion.
Yeah, so it's very much subjective, and if you're first starting out and then there's no experts in quote unquote experts in the field, then who do you turn to for that? No one.
Yeah, so we're just making it up.
Yeah.
And then we're establishing these kind of standards that then we hold everybody to. That could just be groupthink.
Wow, you're blowing everything apart, Adam.
This is why I stopped that YouTube channel. I never made this episode. I stopped right there for years, and it's been, pardon my French, it's been fucking with me ever since. Because the whole thing kind of falls apart a little bit. It's just people's opinions.
Right. And who do we deem as experts, right?
Right. And if you look at the history of psychotherapy, predominantly it was usually white men in control of the institutions. They're still in control of many of the institutions of power, specifically. So traditionally marginalized populations, not really considered. People who are writing in other languages, typically not well considered. So it's like English-speaking, male-identified figures generally. And now it tends to be fairly wealthy individuals with respect to like the global perspective of wealth, fairly wealthy individuals in the United States in academic institutions here, to some degree in Europe as well. But like, to have a different opinion is to step outside of the standards of the field that really we just contrived to begin with.
Right. It's all contrived. Yeah. Oh. So I don't know. I guess because I guess we don't really have an answer then to the question right now of like, how do we measure growth in therapy?
Yeah. Well, let me try to offer a few directions, because I will say I think this is something that I'm actively working on now, is trying to kind of get to a better answer of that question. Um, on some level, I do think that there's an individual growth, an individual differences answer to this question to some degree, which the empiricists would hate, because if I hearken to individual differences, then I don't have a standard. And if I don't have a standard, then I don't have a construct. If I don't have a construct, then what the hell am I measuring? I think that's a fair charge. But I think to some degree, what represents psychological health for an individual is likely to be different for different individuals. The way that I mean to live my life is different than the way that you mean to live your life. That said, one of my students a couple of weeks ago, when I gave them this question, made that argument, and I pushed back. I do think we have to establish a standard. I do think we need to figure out what are the basic elements of psychological health. And again, I would like a little more time to try to polish that definition, that working definition. And I'll work with my students more on that question. But once we have something of a framework, I want to start to test it out here, with the caveat being I don't have the answers. I'm seeing the problems clearly, and I hate when I can see the problems and not the answers. But I need to be honest about where I'm at in the process. That I'm playing with the ideas of what might be an answer at the same time as being quite certain about what some of the problems are. It's an uncomfortable place to sit.
So I guess someone might be listening to this and they might say, okay, so if we don't have a measure of whether psychotherapy works, then is it even worthwhile? Do I even go? Like, what's the point?
I think that is the existential questions that psychotherapy needs to contend with right now. How do we actually legitimize ourselves as an institution? How do we know that we're actually being helpful? I believe that we are being helpful, but that's subjective. I believe that my clients believe that we're being helpful. I think that they see value in our relationship and in the wisdoms that are provided within them, and the things that we explore together, but that too could be subjective. So I think we have to challenge ourselves to really dig into that question. How do we know this is working? And I wish I had a clear answer for us here today, but I just don't. And I think that I think that's the big question we should all be stuck on right now. At the same time, and I'm not abandoning the position I just made as I say this other thing. This is the part that's going to make it seem like I'm legitimizing the institution based on a subjective opinion. I'm not doing that. I'm just trying to kind of share what that subjective opinion is, while recognizing that it doesn't legitimize the profession. I have been in those sessions. I've seen the change in people. I've helped a number of people a number of times with a number of things, and you can sense the general shift in their attitude. You can see them go from distressed to calm, though that may not necessarily be an outcome that we should be aiming for in all instances. You can see them gain some clarity on their path. You could see them, struggle for days to sleep because they're stuck on a question, have a conversation, and then be able to sleep. You could see them reorient their lives toward a new direction as a result of a conversation. And something we've talked about in this podcast before is, I know for a fact that certain people have gotten married because of the conversations that we've had in these sessions. I know other people that have gotten divorced because of conversations that we've had in sessions. I know of children that have been born partially because of conversations that have been had in psychotherapy. I know that careers that have changed, people that have moved, entire life paths that have shifted as a result of psychotherapy. So there's no question that it's powerful. But I think we have to hang on to the question of like, how do we make sure that we're clear on what we're doing in a consistent manner?
That was beautifully said. Yeah, and I concur. I mean, I've been in sessions with clients and seen growth in them and working with clients for a long period of time. And I've felt the shift, but like, how do you quantify that shift? How do you measure that shift? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but based on my own personal experience, I can sit here and say, yeah, I do think it's worthwhile. But as far as exact measures of that, still working on it.
Yeah, and I think that that's partly the humility we need to have here. We need to recognize that as we're trying to legitimize this institution, we are among the most biased people in the entire enterprise. We start from the assumption that it is valuable, and we try to prove why it is valuable, rather than what a more objective scientific approach would take, which is to objectively explore whether it is valuable. I will also add here, it's not a monolith. It's not one thing. Psychotherapy isn't one thing. We practice psychotherapy differently here than they do at other practices. So that adds a layer of complexity too. When we say, does psychotherapy work? For what, for who, and with what approach? I don't know. I will say that with respect to the way that the institution has legitimized itself already, which is toward, let's say, measures of depression or something of that nature, the evidence within the institution is quite clear that psychotherapy is valuable across the board. And you can hearken to some things like Cochrane reviews, which is just a really formal, rigorous way of conducting a deep literature review. There's little ambiguity about the validity of psychotherapy from that perspective, but it starts with some of the predicates that we've been deconstructing in this conversation. It starts with depression as a thing defined in the traditional sense, measured in these ways. It goes from there. And so if you start to pick at, wait, but what is depression? How did we define it? Are we sure about that construct? What does it measure in terms of a true criterion? That's where you start to get lost in the way that I'm lost, where that research doesn't actually help me with the argument that I'm trying to make. So there's two sides here. If you ask a standard therapist, a researcher, they can point to all manner of study that make clear the value of psychotherapy. It's just predicated on these things that I'm trying to deconstruct a little bit, which makes my job a little harder.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, thank you for letting me get into some of these machinations a bit. It's been bouncing around in my head for several years. So thank you for helping me get it out.
Yeah, of course. It was fascinating, honestly. And it's a conversation we'll continue to have. All right. We have a new quote. Obsessing about why is an abandonment of what is.
Yeah, what do you think?
I don't know. I'm conflicted on this quote. I think I've heard you say before, like, doesn't matter why. I don't care why. What's going on? Like, let's work on what's actually happening. And we don't need to like get bogged down in the why. But I think a lot of other therapists do spend a lot of time focusing on the why, like psychoanalytic therapists. They're all about the why. That approach is really focusing on early years, childhood, and what sort of beliefs kind of got cemented in our younger years. But yeah, so I don't know. I don't know how I feel about this quote.
I think the operative word here is obsessing. I think why is a great question. In fact, a lot of psychotherapists are taught early in their careers not to ask why. And God, that just irritates the crap out of me, because why is a fine question. But obsessing about your why often is an abandonment of the what is. Like, I'm so struggling with the idea of what is actually happening right now, that I'm almost going to kind of like detach from it by obsessing about how we got here. And that does kind of represent a way of struggling to just accept things as they are. So asking why is probably fine. Maybe even focusing on why could be fine. But obsessing over it, at some point, you need to recognize where you're actually at and what is actually happening and begin the process of acceptance of that.
So focusing more on the present moment and being less like stuck in the past.
Yeah, I think it's possible to tip too far into either. So perhaps the issue is obsessing rather than why or what is.
Okay. No, I like that. I like kind of having sort of, yeah, I think the obsessing part is the key to this, because I think exploring the why can be valuable. And I also think being in the present moment and just focusing on what has actually happened right here and right now can also be very valuable. And so, yeah, I think the problem would be in just focusing on one or the other and not, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go.
Well, Adam, it's been a great episode. I hope everyone enjoyed. And if you are interested, as always, in a free consultation, head on over to delvepsych.com, delvepsych.com, and check out our Substack. We have a lot of blog posts on there that get into meaty topics, just like this one, at delvepsych.substack.com. We'll see everyone next time.
Thank you so much, Allie.